this episode, we want to come to chapter 2 of Matthew's Gospel, and there we meet a completely new type of writing, and that is that Matthew gives us an interpretation of history and not just chronological facts. This is a very new way for us, but for the Jewish writers, it was a perfectly normal way of communicating a message from Scripture. And what you have is an inspired writer commenting on other parts of Scripture and putting it together and giving you a wonderful picture here and now of how reality has actually panned out at the time. And so this type of writing is called Midrash, M-I-D-R-A-S-H. And the scholars, I've already hinted, have tell us that there are 4 different levels at understanding the Scriptures. One is the surface story, which is obvious to everybody. And then the second level is that when they make allusions in the text, that they want you to connect one text with another. I did that in the last episode, connecting Joseph in Genesis with Joseph in Matthew's Gospel, so that you learn more by putting the 2 persons together than by looking at them separately. Now, the third level of interpretation is the spiritual message that the author is trying to put across. That's the whole point of the thing, that we will get this deep spiritual insight into the text. And then the fourth level is the overall global picture that they're actually communicating. Now, Matthew has all these levels in this wonderful text that unfortunately we call the story of the Magi. And some of the headings we've put on texts have shut us off from seeing the wonder that's actually there. So being a very tidy, organised writer will let Matthew say things the way he wants to say them. For example, he wants to tell you where Jesus was born. He's now told you who he is, and he's told you the circumstances of his coming into being. But now we have to find out where is he born, because the prophet Micah chapter 5 verses 1 and 3 and 2 Samuel 5:3 both said that he was to be born in Judea. So chapter 2 verse 1, Matthew tells us, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea during the reign of King Herod, then these wise people came from the east. He just gives you the bare facts. He doesn't give you any story leading up to it. He doesn't give you any of the details around the birth of Christ. He simply says that this has happened. Why wouldn't Matthew give you details about the birth of Christ like Luke did? Luke gave an enormous number of details about the birth of Christ. The answer, of course, is very simple. Luke had already done it. The stories were out. They didn't need the details. And so everybody knew, at the time Matthew was writing, everybody knew the details of Jesus' birth. So Matthew simply states it. Now, why is he stating it in the way he's doing it? Because he wants to tell you that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, the place that was prophesied for the Messiah. He was born in Judea, Bethlehem of Judea. You see, there was another Bethlehem on the far side of the Jordan. So Bethlehem of Judea was very important. That meant that Jesus was a Judean. Now, here's the key for understanding John's Gospel. In John's Gospel, one of the big issues is that Jesus, a Judean, is taking on the Judean leadership. Now, John brings that out much more clearly than the other Gospels, although for me it's clear in Matthew as well. He's a Judean, he's one of them. And because he is one of them, they will not accept that he won't play ball as they want it to be played. So, he's Judean. Therefore, he's the King of the Jews. He was born in Bethlehem, he is the Messiah. A virgin has given birth, therefore he is the fulfillment of that. He is the Emmanuel. And his adoptive father is the rightful heir to the throne of David. Therefore, Jesus is the King of the Jews. He's the Davidic Messiah. He's the Emmanuel. He's God with us. And we're only at the beginning of chapter 2. Now, I want you to see what Matthew is doing. He's actually building up the evidence as to who Jesus is. You need an enormous amount of evidence before you will ever touch the passion. Because if you touch the passion without all the evidence that Matthew gives you, you are not going to see what you should see. And you're not going to understand what you should understand. And you'll get it on a superficial level or a pious level, but that was never intended by anyone. Now that Jesus is born, what next? The world was divided into two parts in the Jewish mind in those days, and that is, it was Jews and Gentiles. In other words, there was the chosen people and there was the rest of the planet. So the question is sitting in the air. How did the Jewish people respond to their Messiah being born? And how did the Gentiles ever get to know about it, since the Jews would never tell them? And Matthew says, turn the thing upside down. It was the Gentiles who found him and told the Jews. It's incredible. And when you look at the reality that Matthew is trying to put across to you, you realise that things are not at all the way they seem, or that you might think they should pan out. It's just not that way at all. And so immediately here at the beginning of chapter 2, Matthew tells you that there were Gentiles seeking to know what God wanted from the human race. They were trying every way they knew to find out. Since they were from the East, meaning Persia, meaning Iran today, they were very much into astrology, as all the ancient world was into astrology. And they discovered that a star had appeared 2 years before now. And according to their way of reckoning the stars, that this star pointed to the fact that a king, a very special prince, had been born. And that they wanted to find out who this person was, because in spite of everything, when you consider the movement of the Jewish people, when I say Jewish people, I really mean the people from all of the land, the chosen people, the 12 tribes, because they weren't called Jews until nearly the time of Christ. The tribes of Israel, who had been scattered into what nowadays we call Iran and Iraq, and into Syria, and up into Turkey, and eventually up into Europe, what these people actually told the neighbours around them in their experience of their exile, that's how the message got out. The Jews didn't intend, I shouldn't say the chosen people didn't really intend evangelizing the people around them, but that's what actually happened. The message got out. So it wasn't unusual for these people, therefore, in what was known as Persia, or the kingdom of Assyria, it was known before that, that the people from there would have known this. I mean, I was fascinated when I went to Africa as a missionary back in the early 60s, and we thought we were going to be revealing the gospel to some people, you know what I mean? Instead of that, I joined the people when they gathered at night and listened to their stories. And I heard the stories of the Old Testament. So I decided to test them out. And one night I asked the chief, could I have permission to speak? Because I would always keep the rules of the tribe. And he said, certainly. And so I told him the story of Abraham and his 2 wives without mentioning any names or dates or anything else. And I asked him to explain how Abraham could possibly have rejected Hagar if he was a just man. And the chief said to me, that's our story. Who told you that? Now, I was the missionary. I said, if it's your story, what's the man's name? And he said, Abraham. I said, where did you hear Abraham? Oh, he said, this is why I'm telling you, All the stories, he said, have come down from North Africa, where the people in North Africa all knew about the Christ in the first couple of centuries. And they said the merchants brought the stories down to us. They knew most of the stories without us ever telling them anything. These wise men who came from Persia or Iran, if you want to call it now, or Assyria, if you want to give it an original name, these people, it wouldn't have been unknown because the tribes of Israel had been among them for so long. And so they decided to follow this star. Now, there was a particular mention of a star back in the early part of the Bible. You find it in the book of Numbers, chapter 24, verse 17. These men would have known about it because of the Israelites speaking to them, and they decided to follow it. This was what the text said. These were the words of Balaam. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come forth out of Jacob, and a scepter shall arise out of Israel. So they said star and scepter. That means this star is the sign of a king who is born. That's where they got the message. And so they knew that the country that was expecting somebody very special to arrive, that country was Israel. And so what did they do? They followed the star and they were guided all the way to Israel. And they made a very simple mistake. And the very simple mistake, human beings make a mistake. Humanum est errare, it is human to err. A very simple mistake. They presumed that if a very, very special person was going to be born in Jerusalem, that the leaders of Jerusalem would welcome him with open arms. How wrong they were. How absolutely wrong they were. So they went to Herod, the worst person on the planet to go to with information like this. This Herod that they went to was called Herod the Great. And he was called Herod the Great simply because he put up great buildings and all that kind of stuff. He was a murderer. He murdered 2 of his wives and several of his sons. And he was completely capricious, and it was nothing to him to kill. His title was King of the Jews. And anybody who knew Herod the Great knew that there was one thing that you could not bring up in his presence, and that is that anybody else might be called King of the Jews. It would be intolerable. He would kill instantly. And so these poor innocent creatures coming from the ends of the earth went and asked this man, where would they find an infant King of the Jews? Now that's a bit like visiting Satan and asking Satan, where would I find somebody who is God's ultimate treasure? Instantly Satan would want to destroy. I'm just giving you imagery to help you to understand. So it's very interesting what Matthew actually says. So these innocent people come from abroad, and the text I want to highlight for you is chapter 2, verse 4. Herod called together all the chief priests and the scribes of the people. Now, chief priests, scribes, Pharisees and Sadducees were the people who made up the Sanhedrin. Chapter 2, verse 4, they meet for the first time dealing with the question of Jesus, and they are inadvertently involved in having an attempt made on his life. You won't hear from them again, not as a body, until the Passion of Jesus. And they will meet again, and this time they will decide to kill him. So here you have the whole gospel framed in 2 meetings, and it's the meeting of the Sanhedrin. Okay? And Matthew uses exactly the same expression for the first meeting of the Sanhedrin with regard to Jesus and the final one. And that is that they, Herod and the Sanhedrin and the whole of Jerusalem were perturbed, is the translation. Matthew says it caused a seismos. I want you to hear that word. It caused a political earthquake. And Jesus caused a political earthquake here at the beginning of his life and when he came to Jerusalem to declare himself the Messiah. Up in arms, the whole lot of them. They were not having him, and that was that. So here it is right at the very beginning. And you say to yourself, God has gone to all this trouble to bring this child into being. And all they want to do is destroy him. But look at the modern world. And all the millions of children who have tried to come into the world and have been destroyed by so-called good people. The mystery is not any different. There's some kind of evil behind that wants to destroy the future and wants to destroy what God is doing. And so I want to remind you of something, and this is where in some ways you've got to go slow with the scriptures because otherwise you'll miss everything. This is a jigsaw puzzle and you've got to find all the pieces so that you get the picture correctly. If you go back to the Garden of Eden, when God created man at the very beginning, there was this magnificent creature created by God like himself. And God loved this creature so much that he actually walked with him, went for walks with him and shared with him intimately. It's amazing. But there was an enemy lurking around who was envious of the relationship between that father and that son. And that envious person insinuated himself into the situation using deception to try and bring about the destruction of the son. And he succeeded. And poor Adam fell, and the whole human race fell with him. The same presence is back. Doesn't have to appear as a serpent, because the image of serpent is simply something that is insidious and attacks when you're not looking and attacks you on your weak point and is very devious and all the rest of it. That serpent figure is now King Herod the Great. Told about this wonderful event that God has brought into the world, the greatest creature that has ever appeared or ever will appear on the planet. And the decision is to use deception to destroy him. Herod does the very deceptive thing of meeting the three men, who later tradition called kings. I think they called them kings because they were so regal and noble and wonderful and wise. But he said to them, "You go and find out everything about this child and then come back and tell me." And of course, Herod only wants to destroy the child. But Herod doesn't know that God is speaking through him, and that through him, the King of the Jews, God is telling the Gentiles, go and find out everything about the Saviour and go back and tell the Jewish people. That's the vocation of the Gentiles. And so the gospel spread from the Middle East. It went west, 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 and it has still continued west, and it has almost completed its journey back to Jerusalem. It's absolutely amazing. In the Jewish world of the time, the Gentile people were the last. They were, if you read St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 to 10, you'll hear that the Gentiles were lost in the world, without hope, without God. They were outside the covenant. They were outside the promises. They had no Christ. They had absolutely nothing. They were just fuel for the fires of hell. Last. And what you find is that they're the very ones who come to Jerusalem and who announce the presence of the King of the Jews to the King of the Jews. It's amazing. The last shall be first, and the first shall be last. Now, these men were not the first people to begin the journey or the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. In the 10th century before Christ, the Queen of Sheba visited King Solomon, and she came from the southwest corner of Saudi Arabia and travelled up by water mostly up into Jerusalem so that she could benefit from the wisdom of King Solomon. And these men pick up the journey and they come to Jerusalem 1,000 years later, okay? And they meet the real King of the Jews, the one who is wisdom incarnate. That Solomon's wisdom was only pointing in his direction. But the amazing thing is that the journey to Jerusalem has continued for the past 2,000 years. It has never stopped. And the Gentiles are still seeking the King of the Jews and to find his wisdom. That's a very important point that Matthew wants to tell you. Not just that these individuals made the journey, but that they represent the whole of the Gentile world coming to meet Christ. Now, if I had loads of time, I'd give you all of this from the book of Isaiah. It's all there, every bit of it. Let us go up to the mountain of the Lord so that we may walk in his ways and that we may know his paths. Okay, so Matthew wants to tell you that there were 3 responses to the birth of Jesus. 1, fear and jealousy on the part of Herod the Great, who would not tolerate any rival, and so an attempt to destroy him. Complete indifference on the part of the Sanhedrin and the Jewish leaders, who should have been the ones to welcome the Messiah with open arms and make sure everything was fine for him. They did not even bother to go to Bethlehem to check out the facts. And the third thing that you have, that Jesus actually picks up in his teaching on prayer, asking, seeking and finding on the part of the Gentiles. Ask and you will receive, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened unto you. And in this story of the Magi, you have the Gentiles taking the trouble to ask and seek and knock at the door of Jerusalem, and they found the King of the Jews. It's a wonderful message that Matthew is actually presenting to us. And so he gives it to you as something bigger than just simply facts. Up to now, he's just given you fact, 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 fact. This time, what he does is he gives you an interpretation of facts. And the story we've just read, I could give you another entire session on this one. But the journey we've just read is actually the way biblical writers write. They want you to hear, I'm not just telling you a story. I'm not just giving you facts. I want to give you understanding of what God is doing today. Thank you for joining us. Slán agus beannacht déilibh. Goodbye. God bless you.